Hello everyone, today we take a brief look at essentially luxury textile products in 14th century Europe. So we focus chiefly on silk, on cotton, and essentially the main operators in this sector, trade specifically, but also production, and the main centers. So we're basically looking at the intercontinental trade between Europe and China, the Italian and Flemish textile production and markets. Always given, as a precondition, we're talking about about luxury fabric, right? And this, par excellence, was silk at the time, right? And the finest came from China itself. This traditionally was, the Europeans had already began their sericulture, essentially, but China had a much more extensive, and I'm not sure whether intensive, but yeah, I think so, properly quality, production. If you look at, so I've inserted here some picture of Chinese art even from the 12th century, which shows a degree of detail, like in comparison to 12th century European art. This thing was hyper sophisticated, right? Hyper advanced, and this is on silk. It's textile. So there were certain techniques behind this were being pioneered by the Chinese, and you know that the 14th century is actually the century of closure of the the Silk Road. Right, the Mongols, the Pax Mongolica had fundamentally opened communications via land between Europe and China, or at least had facilitated them in the sense that being under one sole rule, there were less tolls to pay, whereas the more the situation grew politically fragmented, also with the same splitting of the Mongol empire into various, into smaller entities. This fragmentation brought each power to exact more tolls, etc. But let's say between the 13th and the first half of the 14th century, roughly, Europeans began to go to China, actually very often, right? They mostly were Italian merchants, right? This went in parallel to something that now it's been a bit reevaluated by global studies, all these things that I personally find ridiculous from a methodological point of view, at least in the way they are and they are carried out today, but are definitely very fascinating. On I should open a parenthesis why I believe that, because actually we know something that any medievalist is known, that like there were properly Christian colonies in China. There were Franciscans having monasteries in there. There was this strong Italian presence via trade. I don't know, think about Marco Polo, whether his story is real or not, but it's plausible. These people went back and forth all the time. It's just that literally it ends there in terms of what we can know. Right, unless some Chinese archaeological mission discovers something that it's highly unlikely. But we rely just on 13th century sources, and that's it. And you have to live with that. And instead, people keep writing articles and in other the other works as is, oh no, what's behind this thing? How can we know the perspective of the whole thing? It's those sources. End of the story, right? I know historically you can dig, you should ruminate on such things and evaluate the importance of how this can fit in other, also it's a matter of interdisciplinarity. It's a matter of, banal just knowing what do they know in China about this today, right? How did they study historiographically? These are maybe interesting things, but from the historical matter, eventually these contacts were cut. And in the absence of other actual evidence, it's a bit difficult to keep expanding on these topics, just because they're global history and it's trendy today, right? It's just to shock the naive. Of course, people traveled at the time. Of course, there were Europeans in China. Of course, this is a normal thing, right? So silk was brought back here. So the Chinese silk were the most famous, so much that this would bring, I don't know if you realize what it means, a land travel by 13th, 14th century standards, right, across thousands of kilometers, right. By the way, in lands that were roughly civilized, right, between Europe and China, that surely were specialized in these forms of, so trade was full of caravans that were organized and all these things. But, think at how much the value of such products justified such movements and how much it costed. Like, think from a physical point of view in terms of calories, how much it takes to shift, human beings from Europe to China, and to think that all what those calories costed was still worth the travel back and forth, eventually what those products would be sold like. When that's why this is luxury, but still, not just a few products after all. This was a fairly intense trade, right? So as we will see, the markets, especially these products, were for royalty and other very high, individuals, etc. But still, it's remarkable in perspective. Before 1340, Francesco Pegolotti, that possibly at the time when he was running the Bardi branch at Famagusta in Cyprus, with its sub-branch in Armenia, wrote in his notebook that, what he could gather about the possibilities of trading with China, right? And this was the point, right? That all that crossing of Asia was worth to bring back those finest silks, right? And would manage to cover for still this enormous costs. So this is explicit from our sources. We know also Franciscan bishops in China writing back letters to Italy, right, hinting at the presence of Genoese merchants in China, right? For example, in 1326, in the southern region at Zaitun, right, which is incidentally, in fact, the city that gave its name to what? Our word satin, right? It comes from the Chinese city of Zaitun as a textile name. And silk fabrics from China were also, however, produced elsewhere, right? For example, in Persia, Asia Minor, Syria, as we'll see also in Europe, and especially northern Italy. And so there was a flourishing, market about this luxury products. That naturally also shows the surplus that at the time these civilizations had, right, to properly invest in such vital, I'd say, items. And that had been an emanation from China fundamentally, right? This goes for many things. Think about paper, right? The long journey of paper since the 8th century through the Arabs, eventually went to Spain, then to Italy, and to the rest of Europe. Well, that was still a Chinese channel fundamentally. That, however, had taken root from the other side of the Asian continent, right, crossing the mountains and the deserts, Central Asia, that still historically had divided, or at least, separated the distances of these peoples. And the local European production of silk was remarkable, right? By the year 1300, the Tuscan city of Lucca had already been long established as the dominant silk weaving city of Western Europe. The Lucchese made a freaking lot of money with that. Interestingly enough, the Lucchese industry imported silk from Sicily and Calabria, right? These southern Italian regions that had witnessed, famously, a tradition of silk production. If you look at Norman times that at this point were past, but probably also Arab ones, you notice there that there was an important tradition, and still fundamentally, it wasn't much about the raw product, the product, but it was rather about the work that made these eventually properly the clothing, the textiles, commerciable and so in such a profitable manner. We know that the Genoese brought silk fundamentally from Asia Minor back home. Also, some little raw silk was provided locally for the Lucchese from the close province of Luni, right, which was actually the first area to produce silk in Tuscany, right. And the silk fabrics woven in Lucca were eventually exported in the rest of Europe, right, by the Lucchese, but also other Tuscan merchants who sold them together with the other, with other fine silk stuffs made in the East, even finer ones as we've seen coming from China. It also with other products, given that basically at this time, and we've seen many times, the Italians dominated the trade between East and West, so they had a sort of monopoly in the market. And the Lucchese fabrics began properly to substitute for Middle Eastern fabrics, right, that were originally substituted for Chinese fabrics there. This because essentially of local production. There was, for example, the light fabric of Sandal, right, was the commonest type of silk cloth. Well, this was extensively used for garments, their linings, right, for furnishing, and even for banners, right. It was available in many colors. It was woven in all the silk weaving areas of Asia as well as in Italy. Sactan and taffeta were related to Sandal. They were also of Eastern origin. In fact, the name taffeta comes from the Persian tafta, but they were also woven in Europe. There was the heavier samite, for example, was stronger, more lustrous, plain, mostly used for dress furnishing, right? Favored especially for embroidery. And its name, being Greek, suggests that this fabric was originally Byzantine, right? Albeit much imitated in Italy and eventually, coming from there on the market. Satin was even glossier. Was made in imitation of the fabric originally imported from China, from Zaitun specifically, as we've seen. And the heaviest and most luxurious of the plain silk fabrics were the velvets, right, with this very short but dense pile, which were possibly first developed in Italy proper. And most of the richer silks were not of single colors, by the way. There are much of the art behind these. Production was, in fact, about showing these patterns that could be very, very artistic in nature. We have such examples in semites and velvets themselves. And other pattern 14th century silks were the Bodecan, the Kamakas, right? The latter possibly originally of Asian, right, with mostly zoomorphic, phytomorphic in motifs. The damasks, taking the name from the Damascus style fabric, was distinguished in pattern from by its color, right, not by its texture specifically, the background color specifically. And there was, as we were saying, a very developed, complex, depth of patterns, right? That made actually the wool production also way more expensive than woolen weaving, because it was much more complicated to do it. Brocades and brocaded velvets could also be enriched with the use of silver or gold thread, right, which was actually silver gilt wire wound spirally on a silk thread, making the effect. And as you understand, this was highly expensive goods, right? They could be afforded only by emperors, kings, popes, their courtiers, bishops, princes, some of the magnates of the great cities, but definitely they wouldn't find any other viable purchaser. Still, they started also in European art to embody properly, to be part of a certain, they were a status symbol indeed, right? So they went also with a specific meaning in it. Remember that clothing is never just material in reason, right? These had to show off something that denoted not just status but also certain symbolism broadly meant. As we have seen, albeit almost all of these fabrics, not completely though, were Eastern in origin, they were refined upon by the Lucchese and other Italians. So during the 14th century, the silk industry declined in Lucca because the city had some, serious problems. I would say it by the 40s, it passed in the hands of several signories. It was, depleted of much of its political autonomy. So the ensuing decline, also so demographic and economical, brought many of the Lucchese craftsmen to Venice. Right. During the 13th century, some of them had gone to Bologna already. Right. So obviously, there were people who knew the craft, wanted to sell their, they wanted to profit from it, and if they had better opportunities, they would find somewhere where they could achieve it. And Venice is not a random city in this case, because it was fundamentally one of the principal ports for the import of raw silk, and definitely the most important port in Europe for Eastern trade. And the Venetian Republic replaced Lucca as the most important city for producing silk fabrics specifically. But there were also other silk industries during the 14th century in Florence, in Siena, other Tuscan cities that also traditionally had been into the textile industry. We were very well connected with, for example, English, Flemish, French trade, right? So that, as you know, was also, especially the first two were connected with English wool and the Flemish textiles to the broader, European textile production market. So at the beginning of the 14th century, however, there was still a larger aristocratic market for heavy woolen cloth that had also had its share of luxury level, right? So we're talking about expensive clothes that, like silks, were only sold to rulers and their families, the richest of magnates, and produced for this reason, understandably, in very limited number of places, not just in quantity. So at the beginning of the 14th century, the dominant area in which such luxury cloth was produced was the southern Netherlands. The production of cheap woolens had largely collapsed there by this time. That of luxury cloth continued. This is an interesting trend that goes in parallel with much of what happens in Europe during after the mid 14th century crisis. That is to say, the elites get stronger, the middle classes go down. So fundamentally, the market, production market reshape for essentially making less large-scale textile production like it had been in the 13th century, and making just for the most the surviving enterprises were somewhat also monopolistic in nature, and they would specialize for this heavier, for these more expensive market for the elites that were the ones that basically the only ones that paid concretely. And there is a very interesting illumination in the Lombard Taquinum Sanitatis, dating to the 90s of the 14th century, which illustrates woolen clothing. There is a tailor giving a customer a fitting, right? And there is a legend that says that the best, quote, the best is this kind from Flanders, right? Stating that, definitely these Flemish wools were definitely woolen clothes were some of the best, definitely, at the time. And as we were saying, there were specific cities where this essentially luxury cloth industry was well established that, in fact, during this period had not been affected properly by the broader crisis of the Flemish cloth industry as a whole. We're talking about Mechelen, this Malines, in Brabant, towns like Brussels and Leuven, the quantity produced increased rapidly in the 20s of the 14th century. It wasn't a time of dramatic, well-being internationally from a financial, economical point of view. And there were sometimes even very modest centers, at least medium-sized towns like Tirlemont, the Tienen, that were producing textiles that were exported as far as Hungary and Prussia, right? And later on in the century, also England began again the production of luxury woolens. This was essentially protected by the heavy duties on the export of English wool, right? That were imposed from the beginning, from the beginning of the 100 Years' War onwards, right? And the Brabant and English cloth manufacturers drew on the skills developed in Flanders and encouraged the migration of skilled men as well. In the 30s of the 14th century, the Florentine chronicler Giovanni Villani points out that a significant part of the cloth production in his own city was the highest quality of luxury cloth designed for the aristocratic market. Right? He wrote that the total production, so talking about cheap and dear together, was worth no less than 1,200,000 gold florins. Right? I don't know if you realize what this means. Basically, this is approximately the combined annual incomes of the kings of England and France together. Right? And no surprise that Florence was the richest city in the world at the time. Consider what this meant. Like 1,200,000 gold florins is something astronomical. It's like you could buy, I don't know, 30 cities with, keeping that was another kettle of fish. But let's say that it was such that gives you the dimension of mercantile trade fluxes, the financial. Nicely enough, Florence was the main loaner to the Kingdom of England, Kingdom of France on a regular basis. So these enormous capitals were all fundamentally spent, and, well, not entirely, but let's say they would also provide this incredible political international relevance to Florence that was at that point, mostly, a French Angevin ally, and capable of maintaining that position in Tuscany as the hegemonic city that was in fact expanding at this time in the region. And this production of luxury clothes was a new development in Villani's own lifetime, right? There's never been such a scale of production. By the 20s of the 14th century, some Florentine firms began to import the most expensive English wools directly to Florence, right? Which was normally done via other intermediaries, right? Other markets, right? So some of the most enterprising Florentine merchants began to import directly from England. And initially, this was aimed to produce the essentially imitations of the luxury quality Low Countries cloth, right? So much that in Florence they were known as panni alla francesca, which literally means clothes the French way, right? Because the Flanders was still seen as part of the Kingdom of France fundamentally, and so the most expensive of them were described as a moda di doaggio, which actually refers to the clothes imported from Douai in Flanders, and it was followed eventually in price to that a modo di Mellino, so the way of Malines, excuse me, not Milan, that is another place, and that the a modo di Bursella or a Borsella, which refers actually to Brussels. And the Florentines actually incentivized many Brabantine skilled workers to move to Florence to speed up the imitation of their own clothes. As a consequence, Florence began to produce, essentially specialize in two distinct qualities of woolen cloth. From one side, there was properly the fine quality English wool for luxury markets of the Mediterranean world. So it's always talking about luxury products. This would be sold because of the Florentine Neapolitan connections to the aristocracy of the Neapolitan court of the Angevins, right? That was a preferential market. Then, interestingly enough, this type soon ceased to be properly thought as an imitation, right? But as a luxury fabric in its own right. So much that the Florentines could sell it at even higher prices than the woolens produced in Flanders and Brabant themselves. So basically, they began to make them better than the originals, being increasingly known as Panna di San Martino, which took its name from the quarter where the manufacture of such cloth was concentrated, because the various corporations had their own, they were scattered, distributed in a specific way within the city, concentrated naturally. The other type was instead the panna di garbo, so basically the garment cloth that remained, in spite of the mid-14th century crisis, like of course a bit like everywhere at the end of the day, the traditional cheaper mass market fabric, right? That was made from poorer Mediterranean wools, right, from somewhere else. We made a video on wool production in late Middle Ages, especially from southern Italy and especially even from Castile, right, that began to make an astonishing amount of money actually through the huge, enormous mass production of wool, but still not being able to compete with these, with the imports of, of the north. To be still, however, reworked as we've seen in places like Florence at even higher quality than the original. Alright, and there would be actually a lot to add to this because it's actually interesting, but it's also complex. Same time for today, we stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.